Hey, before we get rocking and rolling today, I just want to say thanks for listening and thanks for taking a valuable hour to an hour plus out of your life each week, maybe more, maybe less, and spending it with this show. There's so much out there competing for our very finite attention. It's very zero-sum. Listening to CNF Pod means you're not listening to or reading something else. So I just want to say, for those who spend that time with this show and with the guests on the show we look to celebrate, thank you. Thank you so much.
Ideas don't sell books. Ideas don't make books. Ideas make textbooks, but characters make books. Stories make books.
Oh, hey there, CNFers. This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. How's it going? Did you finish the thing? Did you start a new one? Did you start a new one at the expense of the thing you should be finishing? Speaking from experience, you'll soon have a pile of false starts and nothing to show for it except bald tires and an empty tank of gas. It's true. Howard Bryant is here. Holy cow. Holy cow. I tell you, I've been such a fan of Howard's work for years. He's a longtime baseball writer and author. He was the guest editor of the 2017 edition of Best American Sports Writing. He's the author of The Last Hero, A Life of Henry Aaron, The Heritage, Black Athletes, A Divided America, and the Politics of Patriotism, Full Dissidence, Notes from an Uneven Playing Field, and his most recent biography is Rickey, The Life and Legend of an American Original. It's published by Mariner Books, and that's Rickey Henderson, the all-time stolen base record holder, the leader in leadoff home runs. Fun fact, in my beard eye playing days of college and post-college days, if you led the game off with a plunk, we called it a Rickey because you led off the game with a splash. Yeah, that happened. Anyway, like all of Howard's work, it's a spectacular book and it's a fun book. One Howard desperately needed after writing heavy books like The Heritage and Full Dissidence. We'll soon get to Howard, but first a little housekeeping if you'll indulge me. You can always keep the conversation going on Twitter at CNF Pod and Creative Nonfiction Podcast on Instagram. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts and maybe consider leaving a kind review on Apple Podcasts so the wayward CNFer sailing the choppy waters of the podcast ocean might find our little podcast that could. Show notes to this episode and a billion others are at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey. There you can sign up for my Up to 11 Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter where I give out reading recommendations, book raffles, writing prompts, and other cool stuff I stumble across that I think can help you get where you want to go and maybe even entertain you a little bit too. First of the month, no spam. So far as I can tell, you can't beat it. And if you're feeling extra generous, consider becoming a member. Patreon. Hey, patreon.com/CNFpod, where I give out transcripts, coaching, ad-free versions of this podcast when I have ads embedded in the show. I realize coughing up $2 or $4 a month is a lot to ask. That's money that you could be betting on the horses or getting coffee. Who doesn't like to bet on the horses? Belmont Stakes is tomorrow. But you'd be helping fund the audio magazine and the production of this show. It's free, but it sure as hell ain't cheap. Okay, Howard Bryant. He's at hbryant42 on Twitter. His website is howardbryantbooks.com. He's a two-time winner of the Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of the Year for his book Shutout and The Last Hero. Rickey undeniably will be a front-runner for that. It's an amazing book. He's been a senior writer for ESPN since 2007 and is a sports correspondent for NPR's Weekend Edition. You're going to want to pay attention in class, kids, because Howard brings the heat here on the art of writing biography, building the world of biography, lobbying for access to these larger-than-life figures. It's amazing stuff. Some of the insecurities that we all stumble across as writers and our mutual connection with the late, great Dick Todd. who great book editor, Tracy Kidder's book editor, among others. So are you ready? Are you ready? Let's do this. What do you say, CNFers? Here's Howard Bryant. Would be, I think it was 2013. Maybe AWP was in Boston around there, and I was at a bar meeting a bunch of Goucher College creative nonfiction MFA people, and the great late Dick Todd was there.
No,
And
my neighbor, my old neighbor.
yeah, and I saw you had come in the door to see Dick, and I think I said hi to you in passing, but you were there to see Dick, and he's just such a tremendous mind, and he had just a gift for story, and certainly that gentle hand of editing and so forth. I was wondering, maybe you can speak about Dick Todd and your relationship to him, and just what you remember of him.
Well, I think that when you're working on any type of project, especially the lonely trail of writing, you need people who are not only really gifted at what they do, but know how to talk to you as well. And Dick Todd was an old school classic editor who was very firm in the things that he knew to be true about writing, and also was very committed as well to the success of his writers, not only him placing his stamp on other people's work, but to really help you get to where you were trying to go to as a writer. And for me, Dick and my relationship was rooted 100% through Goucher College.
Okay.
Because one of my very, very best friends in the world, Lisa Davis, was part of the MFA program at Goucher when I was at the Washington Post. And so I was living in Virginia. She was over by Baltimore, obviously over where Goucher is. And I was over there for her graduation. And that's where I met Dick Todd. And it so turned out right at her graduation, I was on my way to moving to the town of Ashfield, of all places in the world, of Ashfield, Massachusetts, that had all of 1,600 people. And he couldn't believe, you're moving where? Like no one on earth would point at Ashfield as a place that you would be moving to. And as it turns out, I ended up moving to Dick's hometown. So when I got there was already, the red carpet was waiting to join that lovely group of people. And they were so welcoming, and it was beginning of a friendship. I'm really sad that he's gone.
Yeah, me too. I had the great privilege of working with him as my fourth semester at Goucher. So this is back in 2008 when I finished up, and where I was working on a kind of a horse racing manuscript at the time. And he did have such a great eye for things. And I think even Tracy Kidder, who's sort of a regional neighbor of yours too in Western Massachusetts.
Oh, Tracy's down the street. He used to come to our Super Bowl parties.
Amazing. Yeah,
thanks to Dick.
Yeah, of course. And I think Tracy said, he always felt like Dick was essentially, even when he was in his 20s or early 30s, just was an old soul. He was he was born an old man. And
yeah,
had a very gentle demeanor. And even an email he had wrote me one time, as I was struggling to get some footing and traction with that manuscript I was working on, and I was just diligently plodding away at it. He just wrote a short email to me. He's just Brendan, I think you have, I think you have one of those things. It not necessarily talent or anything, but it's you just keep gnawing at the bone. You keep going after it. And he's I think a lot of people who kind of make it in this, they have the patience and the wherewithal to just endure. And that's put a lot of fuel in my tank over the years.
No, it's very important. It's really important. And it's true. And there are very few of us who get tapped on the shoulder with ridiculous abilities to turn phrases and to have a feel for the work and have a feel for words and all of these in any profession. Even with Rickey, when you talk to, I think JT Snow has a quote in the book where he talks about how there's, what did he say? There's 20%, there's 10% of us who, have to do everything the hard way, with zero ability. It's just all grind. There's 10% of us who are in Rickey's category, where you're God-given, you're just a genius at this, and you can do things that none of us can ever do, no matter how much we practice and no matter how much we try. And then the other 80 is the rest of us. And we're trying to get there. We're just trying to get enough breaks and to do enough and have enough ability to get there. And I think that's a pretty appropriate way to apply almost any profession. Some people are at genius level and you just look at them and you go, I can't do what you can do. And then, most of us are somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. And the danger is so often those genius types are so revered, whether they be athletes or writers, that we, us mortals, we have a tendency to our own detriment, like compare ourselves to them and hold ourselves to some sort of standard that is unreachable, and sometimes that can really be demoralizing. So it's I imagine too there are people that maybe in the writing world that maybe you've tried to compare yourself to, and maybe to your own detriment. Have you run into that issue of comparing yourself to people that might be like a little, I don't know, too far out of reach, and it's just it kind of wounded your pride?
Comparing myself to, it's kind of it's the great line out of Quiz Show. Well, I never considered myself to have a level, but yeah, it happens all the time. I was talking to David Marinus this morning, and I'm reading his upcoming Jim Thorpe biography, and I'm like, I can't do what he's just too good. It's not that it's a competition per se, but
yeah.
You go, oh, this is how you write a book, or this is how you do it, and that sounds sort of ridiculous in some ways, because I've written 10 of these now, so I think I have some idea of what I'm trying to do. But you keep trying to tell yourself, next book I'm going to sound better, next book I'm going to write better sentences, next book I'm going to be more concise here, and I'm going to be more expansive there. And you have to have respect for them, because I'm sure David is thinking the same thing in his own work, and I'm thinking I can't reach you, and he's thinking I can't reach where I want to reach. And so I think it's actually, in some ways, instead of driving ourselves crazy about it, I think it's something to be applauded, that you have enough respect for the work and you have enough respect for the material, that you really, really want to push yourself to do it justice, that you really want to try to be good, because the material demands that you be good. And that part of it, to me, is it's the agony of writing, but it's also the privilege of writing. You also want other people to read what you have to say, so you want it to be something presentable.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you read the greats and you go, I can't get there. And you just throw your hands up and let them round the bases.
Yeah. And yeah, you wrote what you just said, how your hope with the next book you'll get like that much incrementally better, and you've got such a wonderful body of work over the course of your we can just keep with your book writing. What would you identify that you're much better at now than you were even 5 books ago, let alone right at the beginning?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I always remind myself, and I learned it after my first book, after Shut Out, is ideas don't sell books. Ideas don't make books. Ideas make textbooks, but characters make books. Stories make books. Synthesizing makes books. The ability to connect dots and to tell the public, here's why this is important, while doing it through story and anecdote and through people in the way that makes people relate. Oh, I can relate to that. Otherwise, they feel like they're just being spoken at, like you're in a lecture hall. You can write a very dry academic book that has all the information and has all the goods and has all the details. But did you write the book you want to write? Probably not. Unless you're an academic, and I'm not. So for me, the very first thing that I learned in doing this, as I was going into, after the first book and after the second book, was to constantly hone in on your details. And more than likely, and this is why Marinus is such a at genius level when he does this, he can take a story and give you the whole world. There are so many dots that you can connect, that you can relate to, and then what happened, and then what happened, and then what happened. And you get a feel for that universe, that ecosystem that this person exists in. And it will tell you so much more about the world, about that person. If you can explain the world that they live in, if you can explain why they are significant, it will make them much more readable. It'll make the story much more readable. And I think in every book, you are trying to explain, here's why you should read this. Here's why this is important. Here's why this is not just interesting, but here's why it's significant. And to me, that all just goes back to the research. The more you research, the more dots there are to connect. The less you research, the less dots you know exist. The less dots out there. You can't connect the dots because you didn't do the research to know that those dots were there. And so it really always does come down to knowledge of subject, and how much are you willing, or how much are you able to immerse yourself into that subject. And more than likely, there are more connections than you'd think.
Yeah, and I counted in the back of the galley, the e-galley that I had for Rickey, and I might be off by a few, but I counted 127 interviews in the back. And so that's a tremendous amount of legwork for the research. That's just the interviewing. That's not even the reading that you do.
And I'm actually upset about that. That's the piece of the book that I'm the most mad at. I don't think I spoke to nearly enough people because of the pandemic. My initial, the hardest thing about Rickey is, one, he played 25 years, and two, he's young enough where most of his contemporaries are alive. You could have spoken to 1,000 people.
Right.
And so that was really difficult to try to go out and find, I need to find these people. And my initial plan when I first started to work on this book in 2018 was, you could walk into a clubhouse and everybody would have a Rickey story. Somebody would overlap with Rickey somewhere, one of the coaches and even the players, because so many of these players now are the children of former big leaguers. And Rickey is one of those mercurial human beings that just shows up in places. Hey, did I ever tell you the time Rickey Henderson what? He was where? Yeah.
Very Forrest Gumpian like that.
Exactly. He's that guy. And so that was the thing, that now that there's a pandemic, now there's no access. Now you can't walk into the clubhouse anymore. Okay, so what's the best way to proceed? That was really, really challenging for me. And I had a choice because, once again, if you had 10 years to write the book, you could have both. I had 3 years to write the book, so I didn't really have the amount of time to do both. And what I mean by both is, you could really zero in on the research, on the day-by-days. And once again, Rickey played, so you're doing, Rickey played from 1979 to 2003, and that's just the big leagues. It doesn't include the minor leagues, and it doesn't include when he was bouncing around the independent leagues and up until 2006, 2007. So you could go through those day-by-days and go through all that newspaper and go through all that microfilm, or you could also just spend a lot of time just trying to find every phone number in the book, because you can't get a hold of people anymore. The last in-person interviews I did were in January of 2020. And so everything else was, okay, I got to dig in on the microfilm. I got to dig in on the day by day. And so you had to make a choice. And so the choice that I made was the inner circle people that I already had relationships with, to really try to dig in and rely on them while spending every day in the microfilm.
Oh, this episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens. Listen, you've probably heard of these guys, and I have yet to try this product, but what I dig about them is that they're plant-based, which is important to me. Otherwise, this would be a non-starter. With one delicious scoop, you get 75. Wow, that's a lot. Right, Hank? 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food, sourced superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to help you start your day right. This special blend of ingredients supports gut health, nervous system, immune system, energy, recovery, focus, and aging. All the things. I'm excited to dig into this stuff because it's vegan. But if you're one of those keto bros, it's compliant and all that stuff, like paleo too. It also supports better sleep quality and recovery. So if you're an early riser, you can wake up fresher and ready to tackle your work or your workouts, whatever you want to do. I don't know. What else is pretty rad is in 2020, Athletic Greens purchased carbon credits that support projects protecting old growth rainforests. If you want to experience Athletic Greens to make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/emerging. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/emerging to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. And when you're setting out to tell the story of a person that is, so larger than life and has just lived such an incredible life, it can be overwhelming to look at it, globally. Like, oh my God, how do I get my head around this? So when you were set out to write this biography, what was your lead domino? Like, where do you start?
Well, I think the first thing you do, at least for me, when I work on a book project, is you have to have an idea. Why am I here? Right? You ask yourself the existential question. And you're taking on, when it's biography, especially, you're looking at a person. I think of it the same way I did when I did the Hank Aaron book, which was, I just envision a locomotive with a big old coal engine. And somebody there is shoveling all the coal into the engine to make it go. And for me, my first, metaphorical question is, what is that coal made of? What is it that makes this person who they are? What is that coal made of? And you start to think about, can you find a place where you have a point of entry? Is there some point of entry that will allow me to dig into this person's life? Or if you have somebody contemporary that you remember, like Rickey, I saw Rickey play. And so it wasn't like Henry Aaron, where he was born 30 years before I was. Rickey was born 10 years before I was. And so I remember and he played so long, I remember the bulk of his career. So you already had an entry point because you saw it. And for me, the arc that I began to create, and I think that arc, you shouldn't be so dogmatic about it. That arc has to change as you do the research. You do go into it with a premise. And for me, the premise for Rickey was, here's a guy that people talk about with that Forrest Gump sort of mentality. They talk about him, almost this combination between Satchel Paige and Yogi Berra, this larger-than-life American character where these stories can't be true, where all of this feels made up. And then you want to interrogate that. And so that was one of the first things for me was, okay, but when I was thinking about all of those stories and, hey, is the John Olerud helmet story really true? And did Rickey really frame $1 million check without cashing it? And, did Rickey really get frostbite in July? Are these stories really true? To me, I wanted to say, how did we get to this point with this man when in the 80s, when he was at his height, everybody hated him? He was one of the least popular players, one of the most gifted players, but people did not love Rickey. And why? And then interrogate that. So now you've got an arc here. A story is beginning to form. The first arc is you have a guy who was completely unpopular and then suddenly falls into the public's hearts. How did that happen? And then the other part was, why was he so unpopular? And what was that all about? And so you begin to create these different layers of this person. They begin to reveal themselves. And then you decide what is being revealed do you want to examine or make most prominent. And I understood in working on this book that this really is it's the end of a trilogy for me, really, in sort of my work on this, in that although I didn't do the first part of the trilogy, it is the end of a trilogy. I'm on the last two parts. the first part is of the trilogy of American sports in the 20th century, which is essentially the first era is the immigrant era. And, the immigrant era where you have this generation, the second generation of Americans coming in from Europe. And how do they become American? Through sports. The Jews and the Poles and the Italians and the Germans, those kids whose parents didn't speak English, who were their heroes? The Joe DiMaggios of the world, and the Lou Gehrigs and the Honus Wagners. And this is the beginning of the sports century. And then the second era is the integration era, where Black people are now prominent, and they are now part of the culture. And how do they become part of the culture? Through sports, through Jackie Robinson and Joe Louis and Jesse Owens, and now you have a visual, instead of Black people always being in some subservient background. They're now in the foreground, and that began with sports. And then the third wave is the money. The third wave is the free agent era, where the athlete becomes super rich, where they become the commodity, the free agent era. And that's Rickey. That is the less heroic, less romantic, far more practical piece of this story, where now these players have their freedom, and now they are being able to be compensated and to cash in on their ability. And what does that do to the relationship with the public? And how do we treat them? And that's really where Rickey, that was the big piece of this book for me, which was, we are now in that third wave. And we've been in this third wave, obviously, for the last last 50 years almost, where it was fascinating to me doing the research that people were angrier with players in the early 1980s for wanting $700,000 than we are now that Mookie Betts makes $38 million. Yeah. But this is the start. And so you could have written this book on Reggie Jackson. You could have written it on Nolan Ryan. You could have done it on Rickey or Winfield or Magic Johnson, any of those early guys who were at the beginning of this massive free agent era. You have to remember that by the time when Rickey first got into the big leagues in 1979, he was making $17,000. By 1982, he was making $535,000. And so this era is well underway. And so much of the dislike that people had for players like him was, how dare you guys make this much money? The anger was real.
Yeah. And I remember just in the, growing up kind of in the 80s and 90s, and as the anytime a big contract was signed or whatever, I grew up in southeastern Massachusetts, so followed the Red Sox, and my dad was a baseball.
Where'd you grow up?
Little town of Lakeville, probably not so little
Lakeville,
anymore.
or by Middleborough?
Yes, right next to Middleborough. Yeah. Went to Apponequet High School.
I grew up in Plymouth.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, it. Yeah, it's yeah, that's great. Yeah, I grew up there, just next to a cranberry bog, and everything.
My mother worked at Ocean Spray in Lakeville.
Oh, no kidding. My mom worked there the holiday season to make a little extra scratch for Christmas and everything. Nice. And the
cranberry economy.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, and I used to go ice skating on that bog. Peter Beaton was there, and and he was made grew cranberries for Ocean Spray and everything. Oh,
that's awesome. Yeah. Oh, yes. It takes me back.
Yeah, no kidding. But I remember my dad talking, just reading the Globe, and he's like, whenever anyone signs a contract of the of this nature, he's like, not a single person ever thanks Curt Flood for the sacrifice he made to usher in the free agent era. And I in reading the Heritage and reading this, I love the grace notes when you bring in Curt Flood a bit and how he really made this possible for the modern athlete.
100%. And on top of that, in addition to Curt Flood, who was one of the first guys to say, wait a minute, why don't I have the right to decide where I want to play?
Yeah.
You don't own me. And people hated him for it. And they thought he was ungrateful because you get to play a kid's game. It's not a kid's game. This is a multi billion industry. And that's one of the things about this book that I really sort of enjoyed getting into, was when you go back into the day by days. And remember, free agency was only 1975. So by the time Rickey gets into the league, free agency isn't even 5 years old. Baseball is 105 years old, but free agency is less than 5 years old. And when you read the newspaper columnists and you read the letters to the editor and the sporting news, and you read the baseball, you get involved back into the baseball universe. They honestly believe this was a game. This was not a sport. It was not a business. And they treated it as though it was not a business. And in numerous editorials, it's reiterated over and over again that this is not a business. Even though you're being paid X amount of dollars, it's not a business. And so imagine the attitude of a Curt Flood in that, yes, not only is it a business, but I have a say in this business. And the reaction to that after 100 years of infantilizing these athletes.
And because so many of us fans of the sport grew up playing it and know what it's like to play it, like our resentment, just collectively, not like personally, but like the resentment can go to the player because we know what it's like to throw a ball, hit a ball, but we don't know what it's like to be a multi-billionaire owner running this operation, and we're okay with them making hundreds of millions of dollars a year and being worth billions, but we're okay with that, but we're pissed off that a player is making, relatively speaking, pennies compared to that owner. So our resentment rains down on them. And Steinbrenner did a good job of that, of denigrating Rickey in the 80s.
Well, I mean, I think what it comes down to is we allow for, if you wear a suit, we expect you to have money. We don't question the money that you have. We assume that you've earned it, and we've assumed that earning was legitimate. If you play, we assume that you're being given something. If you're black and you play, we expect you to be grateful for being given something. And we're going to get very, very angry if you take ownership and agency of your career. No, you can't do what I can do, and neither can anybody else around here, and that's why you're paying me all this money to do it. If you could do it, you'd be paying yourself, and if somebody else could do it, you'd be paying them. And so that attitude really does infect, and it informs the relationship, this adversarial relationship that people were having with the sport, fans were having with the sport, that the sport was having with its own players. It's one of the reasons why baseball players and owners truly hate each other and have not gotten along since the beginning of time. It really is. Baseball, no matter how you slice it, is a labor story. It's one of the most original labor stories in this country, even though people view it like it's just a game. It's real labor. And the reason why I say real labor is because these guys have power. Most of us don't have any power. We hear, even our unions don't have any power. Okay, we're going to try to, slash our salaries 40%. The union's going to try to get it down to 30%, but we're getting cut.
Yeah.
Those guys are like, we're not taking a pay cut at all. We're going to fight for things that nobody else gets because we have talent that nobody else has. And I think the thing with Rickey, especially in this time period, is he was completely unabashed about discussing this.
Yeah.
It was a huge piece of his personality. This country recognizes, respects, and worships money. Everywhere you go, it worships money. I worship money too. Give me mine. Not a heroic position, not a popular position at all. And also, I'm going to view myself based on money. I'm not going to give you that, aw, shucks. Oh, it's just good to be here. I'm playing a kid's game. I would have played for free. Not Rickey. And this is the reason, as we were talking earlier, when you're starting to build this character, this is why people didn't like him, because he's stealing the joy and the nostalgia and the willful ignorance that we as fans have always had. That isn't it enough that you get the girls? Isn't it enough that you can run like a god? Isn't it enough that you don't have to be in an office building every 5 days a week? And how much is enough? And yet it's a question that we never ask the people who actually own the game. How much is enough for them? So I sort of appreciated this as you go forward in the narrative of the book. It's one of the reasons why when I was actually trying to work on books about this era, a lot of publishers were really lukewarm about it because it's not necessarily heroic. It's something, I mean, fans want to feel good when they read a baseball book. They want to get excited about it and they want to get lost in the field of dreams and the green cathedrals of it all.
Yeah.
And here's Rickey saying, fuck you, pay me, right? To quote our good, late, dearly departed Ray Liotta. That was Rickey. And so, but that's also a huge part of the arc of this book, which is how does that guy that people couldn't stand because he embodied the greedy, selfish athlete of the 1980s, how does everybody universally love Rickey by the time he's 40 years old?
Yeah, and speaking of arc, and then the world building that you were talking about earlier with David Moranis's Jim Thorpe book, which I have a galley as well, and I'm looking forward to digging into that eventually. But that's neither here nor there. But he was you were bringing up about the world building that he accomplishes, and similarly, the world that you were building with Rickey. I think you really start the book with the great migration of Southern African Americans to the northern cities, and Rickey was among that from the Southeastern Conference territory and up to Oakland. So how important was it for you to set the context of Rickey going back to the Great Migration?
Huge. It was and it was so big that this was the original title of the book was Rickey Henderson and the Legend of Oakland. And the publisher didn't like the word Oakland in the title because they thought it was too regional. It was too limiting for the book. So the word Oakland got yanked. But the thesis of the theme of the book really did start with, this isn't coincidence. Like, we talk about the effects of the Great Migration on so many things, but we don't talk about it in terms of sports. We talk about these places as if the players already got there. Like when we talk about Mobile, that you had Satchel Paige and Henry Aaron and Ozzie Smith and Willie McCovey and Double Duty Radcliffe. They were all from Mobile. Or if you go look at L.A., you had Darryl Strawberry and Eddie Murray and Eric Davis, and those guys were there. When you look at Oakland, everyone tells the Oakland story that Bill Russell and Vada Pinson and Frank Robinson were all on the same team. And it's true. And Dave Stewart and Rickey Henderson and all these guys are from Oakland. And I'm thinking, how'd they get there? So much of the story of American sports, especially of that integration era that we're talking about, begins with the migration. How did these guys end up there? And what I found fascinating about that was that so many of these players, they're all from the same place: Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas.
Yeah.
And if we were talking about white athletes, we celebrate white athletes because we celebrate white America and we celebrate the roots of white America, especially when it comes to Ellis Island and immigration. Imagine if we had a generation of athletes who all became world-class and they all came from the same town in Ireland and came across and went through Ellis. That would be an amazing story that would be told over and over and over again. But the Great Migration for these black players, this was their Ellis Island. This is their immigration story. To get away from the Deep South, to go to a place to do better, to have better. And when you start digging in, you can't stop. When you look at Bill Russell and you see Bill Russell is from Monroe, Louisiana, and holy shit, so is Huey Newton, right? And now they live 2 blocks from each other in West Oakland. And then the same thing is true that Joe Morgan is coming from Texas, and then Bobby Seale and Frank Robinson are from, just a few miles away from each other in Texas. And, Rickey is from Pine Bluff, and the Pointer sisters are from Hope, Arkansas, and Lloyd Mosby's from Portland, Arkansas. And then all of a sudden, all these players are from relatively, you take 100-mile radius or so in the Deep South, put a ring around them, and they all end up in the same spot in Oakland. I mean, the Great Migration, segregation, immigration story is a huge piece of this, although it's not immigration because it's inside of the country.
Yeah.
But that migration story is a huge piece of this. And in sports, we never talk about it. We just say, oh my God, it's like something in the water. It's so remarkable that, oh my goodness, it's a coincidence. How did that happen? How on earth did Bill Russell and Frank Robinson, how did they end up on the same team? Well, because the black people who came to Oakland were only allowed to live in one neighborhood and they all went to the same high school. So this is the story that I wanted to tell. And I wanted that to be really front and center. In fact, what ended up happening when we start talking about taking the pieces of the project and putting them together, it really was in a lot of ways at first 2 books. I'm like, this doesn't have to be a straight biography of Rickey. You could tell the story of this, just of this phenomenon. But then you realize that one guy does emerge from this group better than the rest of them, and it was Rickey.
Yeah, and I think what's especially poignant about Rickey, and he came from Arkansas, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And and so when he gets to Oakland, I like how you're able to unpack how insecure he felt about his Southern accent, and how he had to really speak with his physicality, just based on his intellect wasn't taken seriously, based on his athleticism. He wasn't taken as seriously intellectually as he was based on, say, his accent, and then his athleticism it kind of shielded him from that. So I kind of loved how you built in that insecurity that he had as a young person that kind of followed him through his professional career. I thought that was just really well done.
And he was insecure about his education, because Rickey had trouble reading. Rickey was completely secure when it came to math, but not very secure when it came to English and grammar and spelling and the rest of it. And really, one of the more poignant things for me in the book was Mike Norris telling me that he realized that Rickey really could not read very well, if at all, when he was as a teenager. That those kids had so much ability. They had so much athletic ability that they really did get pushed through school. And then I asked Rickey, and Rickey admitted it, that they pushed us through school, that whenever it was game day, it didn't matter if we had a test that day. It didn't matter if I was behind on my homework. It was go out there and play for the school. And that was something that is a story that we've heard really, very often over the course when it comes to African Americans and sports. And so 100%. If you put some words in front of Rickey, he couldn't just wish it away with his talent the way he could everything else. He was such a superior athlete. He could do whatever he wanted on a ball field, but this was one place he really couldn't hide. And then as you get into his story and deeper into the book, it does give you a different perspective, or at least it gave me a different perspective of the Rickey story itself, of all the apocryphal Rickey stories and all the anecdotes, and making fun of him. And so are you laughing with him or are you laughing at him? And I had been forewarning people about the type of book that I felt like writing. I'd been saying over and over again, if you think you're getting 300 pages of really funny Rickey stories, you've come to the wrong place. That was not the intention of this book, to just sit there and tell vignette after vignette of how funny Rickey Henderson was.
Yeah, that's
a really complex guy.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. And that was one of the notes I had made too about. I think you might have written this in the acknowledgments or towards the end. It was, what could the writers possibly know about Rickey? Writing down what someone says is worlds away from understanding them. And I get a sense like this book or any biography done well kind of gets out to the nuance and looks to kind of set the record straight for on a personality, on the totality of their lives. And I guess if you had a goal in telling Rickey's story, maybe what was that?
Yeah, well, it was the idea that of who gets to talk for you, who gets to tell your story. And there are so many times when we talk about this, especially in post George Floyd America, where this is a big issue of who gets to speak for you and who gets to tell your story, and what stories get told and how do they get told. And in Rickey's case, and in my case as a journalist, it's the sports. I've always said this when I started my career back in 1991, that sports writers are like Supreme Court justices. They last forever. It's like a lifetime job.
Yeah.
I mean, Bob Ryan was at the Globe for my entire lifetime until he retired a few years ago. And Dan Shaughnessy is still at the Globe. And Dano's been there since I was in the first grade. And so, and they're legends. I grew up reading them. And Peter Gammon started working at the Globe, I believe, in 1969, the year after I was born. And so they got me into the business. And reading all these legends got me into the business, made me want to do this. But then you also realize that nobody who comes from where I come from got me into the business. And when I got into the business, when I would walk into a clubhouse, the number of black players who were relieved to actually see somebody who may have a similar experience to them, try to describe them. And it's a real thing. It would be like, in another sense, how would we feel as New Englanders if we were only described by people who were from Minnesota? They don't know how we are over here. None of them, and a very few, they might be sympathetic, but they really don't know how. You have to know a little bit more. You've got to have that background. And I also felt like when I was doing the research, so it wasn't just me on a crusade. When you're doing the research, you see that the few black writers that Rickey encountered, they viewed him very differently. The coverage of him was very, very different than the coverage of most of the white writers. And they weren't as obsessed with Rickey's quirks and his personality because, it wasn't necessarily that foreign, or they got past it and didn't feel like it was disqualifying. And it's a really, really important point in a sport like baseball. That's not that important in a sport like football or basketball, because baseball forces you to adapt to it. Basketball adapts to the people who play it. Basketball used to be a white Jewish game, and then it was a white Jewish game. Then basketball became more of a black game, and the game began to adjust to that. Then basketball became sort of a black urban game with the ABA merger. And so basketball sort of adapts to that. Now basketball can be sort of a hip hop game where you're watching a basketball game. They're playing music during the game. The guy's bringing the ball up court. You can hear music. And so the sport adapts to the people who play it. Baseball still is a 19th century white pre-integration game. And if you flip a bat like they do in Korea or like they do in the Dominican, or if you play the speed game the way they did in the Negro Leagues, and somebody throws a baseball in your back. So it's really important to try and have a different perspective and understand some of these players on their terms, because that industry does not care about you on your terms. It wants you to adapt to how this game is played. The tradition of baseball is both the greatest thing about it and maybe the worst thing about it too.
Yeah, and you're right. I like how you wrote a lot about the people who covered Rickey, and specifically Claire Smith comes up a lot in the book. And what was your experience speaking with her about how she was covering, get her chance to cover Rickey in the 80s, especially, and dealing, getting their insights from people who were really on the ground covering him.
Yeah, so Claire was terrific in so many ways, and her recollections and those insights. And one of the things that I wanted to do in this book was to make sure that I was focusing on people and trying to stay in the narrative, whereas you could go and spend an entire book going back and talking to people and to how they treated Rickey and what that time was like. I didn't want it to be that journalistically heavy a book. I didn't want it to be a reporter, he said, she said, and then here's how I feel about Rickey 25 years later, because I feel like that changes the story dramatically, because now when you think about Rickey's accomplishments, people are far less likely to criticize him and understand his time. So to me, it was really important to concentrate on what was said at that time. How is he interpreted at that time? And I didn't want to do a whole lot of retrospection on that. So certainly I could have done a lot more interviews going back and talking to people, but it just felt like more organic to say, here's what was said. And you're correcting a narrative. You really are sort of doing a course correction on a person when you're writing, depending on how you want to approach the book. And so the way that I wanted to approach it was to not have the record be corrected by the people who originally created the record. I wanted what they said to stand on its own.
I like to in this biography and the way you went about writing it. I could tell in a lot of moments where you really injected your voice and your writing style into this, which I thought was especially kind of just on the nose in a sense when you have a really voicey central figure who's bigger than life, and it was great to just the little zingers that you got in over the course. Like one like calling drafting an imprecise science was extremely kind to the baseball talent evaluators and insulting to the word science. Fenway Park, calling it like a storage warehouse, more than a storage warehouse than a ballpark, which cracked me up. And then the myriad times where you talk about the baseball's unwritten rules, like lest the wrath of baseball gods be summoned for violating the unwritten rules, according to the stone tablets of baseball's unwritten rules, or all the writtens in all the voluminous Byzantine unwrittens. And it made me think of sometimes in biography, maybe we get hung up on telling the story of the central figure, but maybe there isn't as much room and levity, room for fun. And I could tell you were able to inject your voice into this. So, just how important was that for you, just over the course of the writing of this, to kind of have a little fun with the story itself?
Well, the goal was to have a lot of fun.
Yeah,
and that was the goal, because my last two books have been depressing. They've been really hard. They've been hard on me. They've been hard subject-wise. You're writing about players being blackballed for supporting black people, not for kneeling, for supporting black people.
Yeah,
and Gabe Kapler will attest to that these days, in terms of his statement or his stance yesterday, or do that again, or his stance when it comes to the national anthem and gun violence. It'll be very interesting to watch what happens over the next several weeks and months there. This book is not about black kids being shot by unarmed black kids being shot by police. And that's really the narrative where we've been in terms of the work that I've been doing for the last 5-6 years. And so I wanted to take a step back, and I wanted to have some fun, and I wanted to think about who I wanted to write about and who would give me the sort of professional palate cleanse that I needed, and who was going to carry a book in a way that I wanted to carry it. And I thought Rickey was as difficult a subject, but also as challenging and interesting a subject as well. So it became almost I was never a perfect fit. That's for certain. But this was really the reason. It was, here's someone that you can have fun with. Here's somebody who is a unicorn, and he doesn't exist anymore in terms of the way the game is played. There are so many different things you can jump off and tell stories about when it comes to Rickey. You can tell the story of the death of the stolen base. You can tell stories about, once again, when we talk about baseball, forcing you to adapt to how it's played. And here comes a made-for-TV superstar in a newspaper game. And you can tell all of these different stories. You can tell the story of money, which is one of the goals of this book. And so Rickey checked off a lot of boxes in terms of talking about this third wave, this third era. The other thing about this project that I really sort of enjoyed as well, from the fun standpoint, was the ability to just let it rip and just say certain things and write. It's not written necessarily the way a traditional biography is, where you're writing paragraphs about what this man had for breakfast every single day. Mm-hmm. This was really more about Rickey in an era, and about how he lived in a time where the sport was essentially changing right in front of him. The biggest thing about Rickey, though, that we haven't even discussed, and we've been talking for 40 minutes, is the thing that really made this story come together, which is this man absolutely obliterated the record book. Yeah. That's the thing. That was the piece of this whole thing is, hey, wouldn't it be fun to do a book on Rickey? And hey, you can cut loose, and you're not writing about race so much. But you're now writing about one of the most underrated giants of the sport. And when we were talking about the arc earlier, one of the things that gave this story so much interest to me, that I really was like, oh, this is something that was one of those gold coins that you find. You didn't go in intending to find it, but there it was. was that it was the analytics, it was the sabermetricians, it was all those guys who rehabilitated Rickey as well. They were like, holy shit, look at these numbers. The numbers brought Rickey back. It wasn't the personality that brought Rickey back. It was the numbers. He was vindicated. This is a book of vindication in a lot of ways. That here's a guy that everybody was calling an underachiever because they were so focused on the optics of Rickey, of how he caught the ball with the snap catch and how brash he was in the base paths and how, they thought he should hit 320 when he hit 318 or when he hit 290 and all the things that he wasn't. And then you look back and you go, oh my God, he's destroyed this sport. And it ran completely counter to every way he has been determined, the way he's been described. And how did that happen? And because the numbers were so staggering, even the people that didn't like him had to come around. And that to me is a full circle story. That is when we talk about an arc, he forced you to look at him differently. And Bob Bryant, I quote Bob Bryant in there when he's talking about there's something about Rickey that, is always a pain in the butt. And there's Bill Madden of the Daily News talking about why do you always feel like when you're watching Rickey, you're getting cheated? Look at what this guy did. Are you really going to say he did not give you his money's worth? Did not give you your money's worth? And what I find fascinating about it is, okay, now you got to stop right there and you got to say, okay, what's that all about? And he really does represent enormous change in the sport. One, obviously, you're looking at the optics. Two, obviously, you're looking at his attitude. Rickey wasn't a friendly guy necessarily. But the other thing was that the sport changed around him. Back then, when Rickey first came up and before that, outfielders were supposed to play 155 games a year. Rickey was playing 130 games. That made him a malingerer. But now today, the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim are giving Mike Trout load management to protect his body, which is the same stuff Rickey was saying back in the 80s.
Yeah.
So there is a vindication that comes with this project as well that I was really sort of happy to see realized between two covers.
Yeah, it's like based on his preternatural ability to get on base. And of course, steal base, there's like the Rickey run of him just getting first. He's just like steal second, steal third, scoring an infield grounder or sac fly. Rarely when we like cast back, do we see someone's actual numbers overlaid to today's game, be like, he would be a monster today.
Well, and that's exactly that.
Right.
That's the analytics piece of it. That's the changing universe piece of it. That's the concentrating on what you are instead of what you aren't piece of it. And the real piece of it is how damn good he was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things that I just love statistically about him, he outstole the Red Sox.
Right.
During his career, he stole more bases during that same time period than the whole team.
It's amazing.
I mean, by the time he left the Red Sox in 2002, he had stolen more bases than that franchise. Which is just a staggering thing to say.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not something that you can comprehend. And it's amazing. And I think to fix this, Rickey stole, by the time Rickey had gotten his 3,000th hit, I think it was 2001, that was the year, because then they got Johnny Damon, and then the Red Sox stole more. But I think it was from 79 to 01, the year before, when Rickey had joined the team, he had outstolen the Boston Red Sox. I can't even think of another. And I think the other piece of it, too, was when we talk about obliterating the record book, name me another record. Name me another all-time record. Even Ruth's record, even Ruth's all-time home run record, where you held on to an all-time record as an active player for more than a decade. I mean, Ruth's record, you did it because the ball changed. And so there was that piece of it. And Ruth was ahead of the game in terms of home run hitting. But Rickey broke the all-time record in 1991. He was an active player until 2003.
Yeah.
I mean, there are very few records that an active player just keeps adding to.
Right.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to think, who other athletes or across other sports who might have that kind of, they broke a record basically in their prime and then had the coda of that career, and then, like you say, just keep adding to it. I'm blanking right now if there
aren't that many, if any.
Yeah.
That's why they're called career records. You break them at the end of your career. You break them after you've had your career. And then at the end, you get close enough, and now the record is yours. Rickey broke that record. He was 32 years old. And on top of that, not only did he break the record when he was 32, but the gap between Rickey at number one at 14:06 and Brock at 9:38, that gap itself is top 20 all time. So the numbers, so the point here is that the numbers brought him home.
Yeah.
The numbers made a new generation of people look at Rickey and go, oh, this guy was amazing. And this new generation, which now grew up in television, they grew up through television, and they grew up through cable, and they grew up, through all the modern stuff. They weren't as offended by Rickey. So they weren't hung up on Rickey. They weren't hung up on the fact that he didn't defer to the grand, great old traditions of the game, because this new generation of writer and of player, they didn't care about the great, grand, old traditions of the game. They cared about, hey, I saw Rickey when I was a kid. I went to the Coliseum and saw Rickey, or I remember Rickey in the '89 World Series, or I remember Rickey with the Yankees with the snap catch, and I remember all the things Rickey did. I went to a game and there was Rickey yelling at us, going back and forth with us in the, out in left field. So they were able to view him more holistically instead of being offended by this new presence who is disrupting the traditions and mores of the sport.
I heard you say when you were on the Bryn Jonathan Butler's podcast a couple years ago about athletes and how the big ones like a LeBron or Tom Brady really controlling the narrative, and how really bad that is for journalism. It's faux journalism when we see these things, but it's not real journalism because they're controlling the truth. And it got me thinking about this biography too, and how you navigated the access you would need to not only to speak to Rickey, but to tell a true story not with his cooperation in terms of he's going to have editorial control, but cooperation enough to give you the reins to tell the true story. So maybe you can speak to that dynamic and how hard that is.
Yeah, it's extremely difficult, and it is one of the most difficult things that you will do as a writer, which is how do you tell a story without access, without cooperation? I remember talking to the late, great David Halberstam about it when he was doing his Michael Jordan book, Playing for Keeps, and he said that Jordan had said that he was going to talk, and then Jordan never spoke. So he said, every time you make a phone call, you got to make 5 more. You got to make 2 more. You got to make 3 more. You got to do more research to fill in those holes. It's never going to be enough, obviously, and it's never going to be the equivalent of having this person tell you things specifically directly from, write an original source from their mouths. Rickey spoke to me until he realized it was a real book. Then Rickey didn't want to talk anymore, so Rickey shut it down, and Rickey did the worst thing that you could possibly do to a writer. He told all of his people to shut it down as well.
Ugh.
And that's the one thing Henry Aaron didn't do. When Henry didn't want to talk, Henry didn't talk. But Henry never went to anybody and said, hey, there's a guy writing a book about me, don't talk to him. He never did that piece of it. But Rickey did. Rickey, some of Rickey's closest guys had agreed to call me, and then suddenly I never heard from him. They never called me back. There were some of Rickey's people who had given me interviews and then wouldn't do follow-up interviews because Rickey had shut the whole thing down.
Ugh.
And now you're up against it. Now you're like, okay, I have undertaken this project and I can't finish it. I don't have the access. I don't have the resources to finish it. How do I make this something more than just some regurgitated compilation of newspaper stories? How do you do that? Well, I got saved by the bell because Rickey's wife, Pamela, made sure that didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime I needed an idea, I called her. She called me back. We were on the phone for hours. She was the best source anyone could ever have.
She's one of the heroes of this book, too.
She is the hero of this book. She is She was tremendous. And the reason why she was tremendous is because not just because she didn't want to see me fail. It was because she's truly committed to Rickey's greatness. As a man, as a person, as an athlete, all of it. They met each other when they were in high school. And she has been committed to him and his evolution for almost a half century. And she was the reason why I wrote this book in the first place. She came up to me in 2014 when I was on stage with Henry Aaron, and she said, I want you to do for my husband what you did for Henry. Rickey wasn't into it. Right. Rickey had no interest in this. And if you'd left it to Rickey, if it would have never happened.
Yeah.
But I remember the point that I always make is the stories that we tell are not the most important stories. If we're lucky, they're the most important stories. The stories we tell are the ones that get repeated. And what I tried to appeal to Rickey was I tried to say, you haven't swung a bat in the major leagues since 2003. For somebody to have seen you, to have a first-person memory of you when you were at your very best, they had to have been born at the latest in the mid-70s. Which means they're almost 50 now. And these athletes like to believe that what they did is immortal. Everybody gets forgotten. Mm. The only people that don't get forgotten are the ones we keep telling the stories about, the ones we keep repeating. And the thing that I always like to say about this is somewhere on some subject, there were a couple of people in the 7th century talking to themselves going, nobody will ever forget this. And we have no idea what they're talking about.
Right. And the last thing I've got for you, Howard, is when I like to end these podcasts by bringing this airliner down for a landing by asking the guests for a recommendation of some kind for the listeners. And like I say, it can be anything from a kind of handcrafted coffee mug to a branded tea to a fanny pack. It's any your choice. So I wonder for you, I extend that to you, Howard. What are you excited about that you would recommend to people out there?
What am I excited about?
Yeah.
I remain excited about a couple of things. The first thing I'm excited by is I still absolutely love Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes on HBO. If you can find it on HBO Max, look it up. It's an unbelievably inventive doc series. Depressing as hell, but phenomenally made, and it's an amazing just story tell. It's great. It's great. I'm really I keep talking about it because just from an artistic standpoint, what a vision. Along those lines, not depressing as hell, but equally inventive and amazing and wild and mind-blowing, is Everything Everywhere All at Once. The movie I just saw just a couple of weeks ago with Michelle Yeoh. It's tremendous.
Nice.
It is absolutely tremendous. And then, of course, I'm reading the Jim Thorpe biography, Path Lit by Lightning by David Marinus, which comes out, I believe, in the fall. And it is also great. I'm into a lot of things. Nice.
As well you should, because a lot of those other things, whether it be movies or streaming, or it informs, your main craft, I think. I think it's really important. I think it's nourishing. And then you can be like, oh, how can when I read this novel, like, how can I maybe make my nonfiction kind of really pop like this novel, or something? I think it's very nourishing to have those different, diversified artistic portfolio of interests.
I'm also still very much into Powell's. Are they still doing in person?
I think so. I think they're doing in person now.
I'm gonna go call my publicist and beg to get into Powell's because I would love to go back there. I love that bookstore.
Nice. Yeah, and if you have an event with this or a forthcoming book, I'll be sure to shoot up the 5 and shake your hand because it would be wonderful to meet you in person. And
be my pleasure. Thank you.
Very nice. Well, Howard, I've been a great admirer of your work for so long, and it's been just a lot of fun and an honor to speak with you about craft and about this wonderful biography you've written. So thanks for the time, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Brendan. Be good.
Oh, what did I tell you? How great was that? What a thrill to speak with Howard. The name of the book is Rickey, The Life and Legend of an American Original. It's published by Mariner Books. Get it for the baseball fan in your life, the Rickey fan in your life. I mean, what a life. That dude was amazing. Fun to watch. I remember growing up watching him, the green Mizuno batting gloves, the leadoff home runs that we affectionately named our if you led the game off with a plunkin beard eye, you got a Rickey. Be sure to keep the conversation going on Twitter at CNFPod. Let me know what you liked, and I'll keep doubling down on what keeps you listening, what brings you inspiration and value to your craft. Our craft, really. Consider patreon.com/CNFpod, and you can always head over to BrendanO'Mara.com for show notes and to sign up for the Up to 11 Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. So I've been grinding on this book proposal, still going, chipping away. I got to finish it soon, though. Time is ticking. Time marches on. I don't know if I had mentioned that I got another round of edits back, and there's quite a bit of heavy lifting to do. I've been chipping away at it. I think I'm closer to the end of this round of edits than the beginning, which is always encouraging. My agent has been wicked cool, and she's really sinking her teeth into it, so that's encouraging. It's getting there. I'm delving into a person who has been written about quite a bit, who's dead, and I had one of the comp titles sitting on my desk for upwards of a week. I think it's been more than a week. And I knew there would be stuff in there that would be essentially in direct competition to what I'm hoping to turn up. Probably even richer stuff than I could ever turn up. And I've been putting off reading the book because the last thing I want to do is be reading it and be like, fuck, that's an amazing detail, an amazing scene. And if I use that, then all I'm doing is regurgitating what's already been said, but in my voice, and that's just cheap. That's a cop-out. Sure, you do this to some degree with all your research. You are doing that, but it's just like, it just feels like, oh, someone did some heavy lifting, and then I'm just taking some of that heavy lifting. I want to do heavy lifting, and I want to find good stuff. And if he's already found some great stuff, and the person's dead, then there's a finite amount of stuff. So you need to find different sources. But it's hard, and I've just been really afraid. Like, sure, you have to do this, like I said, but you want to find new ground, find new people, new anecdotes. And I've been scared to read this because if it's as good and rich as I think it is, then what more can I add to the story? What can be said that hasn't already been said? That's the death knell if all you're doing is heating up the meal in the microwave. Have you ever had this happen? Am I just a weirdo? Don't answer that. I get this trait from my mother. If I turn and face the other way and ignore the problem, it'll just go away. Like if I don't open this book and don't read it, then all that stuff in there, it's not there. It doesn't exist. Okay, so when I was growing up, let's maybe say the cable bill came in the mail. This is something that would actually happen. It was definitely symbolic of how lots of things would happen. But she might not open it for days and days. Then let's just say on a Monday, she'd open the bill and put it in a nice pile. Then on Tuesday, she might shuffle it to the other side of the coffee table, maybe put her checkbook on top of it. Then on Wednesday, maybe she'd write the check. On Thursday, she might put the check in the invoice into the envelope and maybe put a stamp on it. And on Friday, finally, it might go out to the mailbox. Sometimes sweeping piles of dirt in the house just to clean the house, there might just be, okay, sweep, a little pile of dirt, and just leave the pile there for days. I got that. My sister got that. She's better at working through these things than I am. So you get the idea that things don't get completed. Anyway, haven't spoken to Mom since Christmas. The dementia thing is pretty gnarly. And I'm not sure if she remembers who I am. It'd suck if she didn't, but who knows. I'll check with my sister, see if she has a memory of me. Maybe see if my sister wouldn't mind putting my mother on the damn phone. So here I am stewing. I've been stewing for weeks, months even. Like, why wouldn't you maybe put Mom on the phone for me? On Mother's Day, this was supposed to happen. We were supposed to FaceTime, and it just never happened. My sister hasn't offered to do something like this, and it seems so basic. And meanwhile, I'm over here like, this is bullshit. Why should I have to ask for something that should be offered in the first place? So what's the lesson? Read the book you've been putting off reading, even if you're scared, if it's covering ground that you're afraid will be repetitive, if you cover it too. Oh, and by the way, stay wild, CNFers. And if you can do, interview. See ya.